The Reverend Thorne Evergreen stood behind the pulpit, his tall figure clad in a severe black robe that seemed carved from stone. The rays of the autumn sun shining through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church created a halo around his graying temples. The congregation listened to his every word, and there was such silence in the church that one could hear the leaves of the maples rustling outside the windows. "Sin lives in each of us," his deep voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, "but true fortitude lies in the ability to resist temptation. We must be unyielding to the weaknesses of the flesh, merciless to vice, ruthless with ourselves in the fight against sin." Mrs. Pettigrew, an old maid who had taught Sunday school for 30 years, nodded approvingly, clutching her prayer book in her wrinkled hands. Beside her sat the members of the Board of Trustees, all as one pillar of Little Millbrook society. Reverend Evergreen was famous for his sermons on morality. He was called the Iron Preacher for his adamant moralizing and his merciless condemnation of any deviation from the righteous path. He was especially fierce in his attacks on the sins of the flesh, and his sermons on this subject would draw a full house. But at these moments, when his voice rumbled through the vaults of the church, when he spoke of the struggle against temptation, his right hand, hidden from the eyes of the congregation by the pulpit, nervously rubbed the rosary. And beneath the collar of his robe, tightly buttoned, there were barely visible traces of a leather collar. After the service, the Reverend stood in the doorway for a long time, shaking hands with the congregation. His palm was cool and dry, and his handshake was firm. He looked each one in the eye and seemed to see all the secret sins hidden in the soul. Back in his office, Evergreen locked the door and sank into a leather chair. He pulled a tattered, black-covered day planner from his desk drawer. Tucked between the pages was a business card with no logo, just a phone number embossed in gold. His fingers trembled as he ran his fingers over the glossy surface of the cardboard. That evening, sitting in the semi-darkness of his office, the Reverend pulled out his phone, dialed a number he knew by heart, but still checked his business card. "I need an appointment. Today." His voice sounded different than it did during the sermon. It was pleading, almost desperate. "Yes, at the usual time. Yes, with Miss Crystal." Hanging up the phone, he pulled an envelope of cash from the safe. His hands were no longer trembling. A strange calm enveloped him. Tonight he would be a different man again. One who hid behind the mask of the stern preacher. One who prayed not only for forgiveness, but for the next meeting with the one who held the keys to his secret self. On the table lay an unfinished sermon on humility and obedience to the Lord. Evergreen smiled. Those topics were particularly close to his heart, though not quite in the way his parishioners thought. He turned out the lights in his office and walked out into the twilight, carrying the anticipation of sin and redemption, pain and deliverance. Raven's aesthetic massage and spa salon was located in an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Millbrook. The 3-story red brick building, surrounded by a manicured garden, looked respectable and solid. On the gate was a sign with the hours of operation and by appointment only. Raven Blackwood had purchased the mansion 5 years ago when she'd moved to Millbrook. Tall, with perfect posture and raven wing hair, she'd quickly gained a reputation as a successful businesswoman. Officially, the salon offered massages, spa treatments, and beautician services. But the main income came from special services for a select clientele. That evening, Raven sat in her office, reviewing notes in her leather day planner. The room was decorated in dark colors, with heavy velvet curtains and antique furniture. On the walls were abstract paintings in austere frames, hinting at certain themes only to the most careful observers. "Marilu, come see me," she said into the intercom. A moment later, a young woman in a strict business suit appeared in the doorway. Her red hair was gathered into a tight bundle and her green eyes looked confident and calm. "You have a regular client today," Raven looked up from her day planner. "The Reverend, do you remember the rules?" "Of course." Marilu took a seat in the chair across from the desk. "No marks on visible body parts, complete confidentiality, special attention to health and safety." "Exactly. He's one of our most valuable clients, and the most interesting." Raven leaned back in her chair. "What do you think makes a man who thunders sinners from the pulpit every Sunday come here?" Marilu shrugged. "Everyone needs a place to unmask, some more than others." The salon had 3 floors. The first was really a spa and massage, a completely legitimate business. The second was rooms for casual appointments. And the third floor was for special clients with special needs. The room where Marilou received the Reverend was called the confessional. Dark red walls, special equipment, carefully selected instruments, everything created an atmosphere of exquisite sin. Here, the iron-fisted preacher became an obedient sheep begging for punishment. He asked for the intensity of the sessions to be increased, Raven remarked, reviewing the tapes. I know his limits, Marilou replied. In her 2 years of working with the Reverend, she had really gotten to know his capabilities and needs well. Make sure he's signed an updated security agreement and check his blood pressure before the session. The salon's security system was well thought out. Each client signed a confidentiality and consent agreement. All sessions were videotaped to protect both parties. The recordings were stored encrypted on secure servers. In the staff break room, Marilou prepared for the meeting. She pulled a leather suit, high boots, and other trappings of her profession from her personal locker. Her movements were calm and methodical, no fuss or nervousness. Do you think his flock has a clue? Raven asked as she entered the room. About what? That their stern shepherd comes here on his knees every week begging for a flogging? Marilou grinned. Not likely. People see what they want to see. Just don't get carried away today. He was on edge last time. I'm a professional, Raven. I know what I'm doing. The salon ran like a well-oiled machine. Clients came in through a parking garage with a separate entrance. Security cameras monitored every corner of the building. Security guards, disguised as regular spa employees, were on standby 24 hours a day. By evening, the salon was transformed. The daytime staff would leave. Only the specialists would remain. Marilou was one of the best. Her clients returned again and again, willing to pay any money for her services. At 9 o'clock, the indicator light on the security console blinked. Another client had arrived. Reverend Evergreen was punctual as always. He was escorted through a secret entrance to the preparation room where he had to change his clothes and sign the necessary papers. Marilou was at this time checking the equipment in the confessional. Bands of varying lengths and rigidity, belt systems, special clamps, everything had to be perfectly clean and secure. She turned on the dim lighting and an aroma lamp with sandalwood oil. Your client is ready, the receptionist announced over the intercom. Have him waiting on his knees by the door, Marilou replied, checking the last details of her image in the mirror. She knew she'd find him in exactly that pose, submissive, trembling with anticipation. The iron preacher, the storm of sinners, would beg for punishment and redemption, and she would grant it to him, as she had done so many times before. Quiet footsteps were heard outside the door, a guard escorting a client to a room. Marilou smiled at her reflection. Time to begin the evening service of a very different kind. 2 years ago, Thorne Evergreen stepped into Raven's salon for the first time before he knew that this visit would change his life. On a rainy October evening, he parked his unremarkable gray Ford 3 blocks from the mansion and, hooded in his raincoat, walked through the deserted streets to the massive gates. Raven herself met him at the front desk that evening. She personally conducted the initial interview with each new client. Evergreen was nervous, his hands clutching a letter of recommendation from a banker he knew from Boston, visibly trembling. Have a seat, Reverend, Raven pointed to a chair. Her office looked more like the library of an old mansion, mahogany bookcases, leather armchairs, heavy drapes. Let me buy you some tea. He declined the tea but accepted a glass of water. Raven studied him carefully, a tall, trim man with a noble gray on his temples and a nervous tick at the corner of his mouth. Mr. Caldwell described your preferences in his letter, but I would like to hear about them from you personally. Evergreen swallowed. I need... He fell silent, unable to speak his desires aloud. There is no room for shame or judgment here, Raven said softly. Everything that happens within these walls stays here. Absolute confidentiality is our guiding principle. I want to be subordinate, he finally squeezed out. To give up control completely, receive punishment. Raven nodded. Have you ever participated in such practices? Only online, virtual. I see. In that case, we'll start with the most basic techniques. You will need to undergo a medical examination and sign a number of documents. In the meantime, I'll introduce you to Miss Crystal." Marilou looked much the same then as she did now. A strict suit, her hair pulled back, the scrutinizing gaze of green eyes. Only they didn't have the imperiousness that came later, after many months of working with the Reverend. "Good evening." Her voice was calm and deep. She sat down across from him, placing a leather folder on her lap. "Before we begin, I need to understand your boundaries and limits. What is absolutely unacceptable to you?" Evergreen looked up at her for the first time. "No visible marks. Nothing that can't be concealed under clothing." "Of course. What else?" "No blasphemy or, religious references." Marilou made notes in her notebook. "And what do you want to get out of our meetings?" He was silent for a long moment, choosing his words. "Liberation. I want to stop being me. At least for a little while." "I see. Are you ready for total submission?" "Yes." His voice trembled. "Then kneel." Then Evergreen froze. Silence hung in the study, broken only by the ticking of the ancient clock. Then he slowly knelt down in front of her chair. "Look at the floor," she commanded. Her voice changed, becoming harsher. "You will address me as mistress. Understood?" "Yes, mistress." Louder. "Yes, mistress." "Good. Now kiss my shoe." He bent to her feet. He was shaking, but not from fear, from anticipation. "That's enough. Stand up." When he rose, his face was red, but his eyes shone with some inner light. "You're fit," Marilou said, becoming businesslike and composed again. "Raven will do the paperwork. First full session in a week." Thus began his journey into his new life. Every week, after the Thursday evening service, Reverend Evergreen came to the parlor. Gradually, the sessions became more and more intense. Marilou sensed his limits accurately, knew when to stop and when to push harder. She taught him to find release in pain and humiliation. Under her guidance, he learned all shades of submission, from light spankings to complex bondage structures. He was especially turned on by asphyxiation, controlled asphyxiation, when the world began to swim before his eyes and his consciousness teetered on the edge. After each session, they spent time in the break room. Marilou carefully covered him with a plaid, fed him warm tea with honey, and treated the marks from the ropes and whips. In these moments, there was a special closeness between them, not sexual, but deeply intimate. "Why are you doing this?" he asked one day as she massaged his slumped shoulders after suspension. "I like the power," she replied simply. "But not just power over the body, power over the soul. When a man trusts you completely, puts himself in your hands, it's intoxicating." He nodded understandingly. "Don't you think it's strange, my profession in this?" "Not at all. Many people in authority in ordinary life seek submission here. It's natural to want to shed the burden of responsibility sometimes, to give control to another." In 2 years, their meetings had become a ritual. Marilou knew his every fear, his every desire. She learned to read his body like an open book, when to increase the tension of the rope, when to loosen the collar, when to stop. Raven watched the progression of their relationship with mild concern. "You're getting too attached to him," she once remarked. "It's a professional interest." Marilou brushed it aside. "He's the perfect sub, obedient, grateful, no silly fantasies of romance." But secretly she recognized that the Reverend had become a special client for her. Perhaps it was the contrast between his public image as a stern shepherd and the defenselessness he displayed in her hands, or the absolute honesty with which he gave into his dark desires. Every Sunday, she went to church and listened to his sermons, sat in the last row, watching him rattle on about sin and vice, knowing that in a few days he would be on his knees before her, begging for punishment. That knowledge filled her with a strange satisfaction, and the Reverend, spotting her in church, would only grip the pulpit tighter with his whitened fingers and speak of sin even more vehemently, as if trying to drown out his own demons. But they both knew that on Thursday night, those demons would break free in the secret room of Raven's parlor. "Harder," Reverend Evergreen exhaled hoarsely. He was hanging in an elaborate suspension system, his body covered in sweat. "Please, mistress, harder." Marilou frowned, watching his breathing carefully. She knew exactly the limits of his endurance after 2 years of regular sessions. "No, that's enough for today." "But I can do more." "Silence." Her voice whipped like a whip. "Who makes the decisions here?" "You, mistress," he replied obediently. After the session in the common room, he spoke again about strengthening practices. Marilou listened silently, massaging his shoulders and back with a special cream. "Reverend, we've discussed this before. There are certain safety rules." "To hell with the rules. I feel like I can take more." She turned his chair toward her. "Listen to me carefully. I'm a professional. I know what I'm doing. Your safety is my responsibility." Something resembling disappointment flashed in his eyes. "You don't understand. I need to feel more." "I understand perfectly well, but we're not taking any chances." Raven noticed a change in the Reverend's demeanor. She reviewed the security footage after each session. It was standard security procedure. "He's becoming obsessive," she told Meryl during their weekly meeting. "Requires increasingly rigid practices." "I'm in control of the situation," Marilou replied calmly. "Everything is within limits." "Are you sure? His latest vitals?" "Raven, I know his body better than he knows himself. Every muscle, every reaction, I can see his limits." But Raven wasn't appeased. She summoned the Reverend for an unscheduled talk. He sat in her office, impeccably dressed, calm, only his fingers nervously rubbing the rosary. "We're concerned about your inquiries," she began. "Perhaps you should take a break." "No!" He almost shouted it, then pulled himself together. "I'm sorry, but it's not possible. I need this." "Then we must discuss new terms, additional security measures." He agreed to everything: regular medical exams, heart rate monitoring during sessions, new restrictions. But there was something new in his eyes, undercurrents, dark. Marilou could sense these changes. More and more often during the sessions, he tried to override her control, to force her to go beyond the boundaries he had set. She remained adamant. "Are you disappointed with me?" she asked after a particularly tense session. "No, mistress. It's just, I'm ready for more." Readiness is not just a physical state. It's also the ability to accept your limitations. At church, his sermons became even more fierce. He spoke of sin and redemption with such heat that some female parishioners fainted. Marilou, sitting in her usual seat, could see him shaking with barely restrained tension. One evening, she found him trying to loosen the safety restraints on one of the suspension systems. It was a serious safety violation. "What are you doing?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel ringing in it. "I was just looking." "On your knees." He sank to the floor. She walked around him slowly. "You violated my trust. You have endangered yourself and put my reputation in jeopardy." "I'm sorry, mistress." "Silence. The session is canceled. You are going home." It was the harshest punishment of all, the session being canceled. He turned pale. "Please don't." "The decision has been made. And if it happens again, we will stop our meetings. Forever." Fear flashed in his eyes. Real fear, not playful fear. Fear of losing the one place where he could be himself. "I won't do it again, I promise. We'll see. Now go." After he left, Marilou sat in the empty room for a long time. She was sure she was right. Safety above all else. But something bothered her. Something in his eyes when she'd turned him down for the session. Raven came in later. "You did the right thing. He needs to understand this is no place for amateurishness." "I know, but I'm afraid he might start looking for alternatives." "Then we'll have to take action." The following Thursday, the Reverend showed up as usual. He was calm and obedient, obeying all commands without question. But Marilou sensed it was the calm before the storm. She doubled her attention to the smallest details, checked every carabiner, every knot, watching his breathing, his pulse, the slightest sign of discomfort. She was a professional and could not allow her charge to hurt himself. And on Sundays, as she listened to his sermons, she noticed more and more how his hands trembled when he spoke of sin and redemption. It was as if some tension was building up inside him, ready to break through at any moment. "Take care of yourself, Reverend," she told him after another session. He looked at her with a strange look. "You don't understand. I never feel more alive than when I'm balancing on the edge." The fringe is not a place to linger long. But he wasn't listening anymore. The same dangerous glint in his eyes that she'd learned to recognize had appeared. The glint of a man willing to do anything for the sake of his obsession. Raven scrutinized the security footage from Reverend Evergreen's last session. On the screen, Marilu checked the bindings over and over as her charge demanded harder, deeper, harder. At one point, the salon owner pressed pause. The Reverend's face, contorted with ecstasy, froze in the frame. There was something frightening in his eyes. 3 days ago, during another visit, he had insisted on changing the safety protocol. He'd demanded that emergency restraints be removed, that asphyxiation times be increased, that more rigorous practices be used. When Raven had refused, he'd allowed himself to raise his voice for the first time. "You don't understand. I need more." His fingers dug into the armrests of the chair. "I pay enough to get what I want. Reverend, we don't trade in death. We have rules." "Rules?" He grinned. "I wonder what the police would say about your rules, or the IRS, or the parishioners." Raven went cold. In the 5 years of the salon's existence, none of the clients had ever allowed themselves to be threatened. The system was built on mutual trust and confidentiality. "You do realize this is a two-way street, right?" Her voice remained calm. "We have materials too." "Oh, come on." He leaned back in his chair. "My parishioners just won't believe it. Your clients, on the other hand, will scatter at the mere hint of scandal. Judge Harrison, for example, has a reputation to protect." Raven stared silently at the man in front of her. Where had that meek, obedient sab gone that he had been 6 months ago? What had turned him into this creature with a feverish gleam in his eyes? "We're closing your membership," she finally pronounced. "Immediately." "No," he pitched forward. "You're not going to do that. Because tomorrow I'm going to start talking. First in hints, then directly. About what's going on in your salon. About the services you provide. About your clients. You're bluffing. Do you want to check?" He walked away, leaving her in her office alone with her thoughts. Raven pulled a folder of salon paperwork out of the safe. 5 years of flawless operation. $1 million investments. Dozens of high-profile clients whose reputations depended on her silence. The next day, the Reverend sent an envelope. Inside were pictures of him entering the salon, copies of some financial documents, a list of clients, and a short note. "Waiting to hear back. You have a week." Marilu noticed a change in her boss's demeanor. "Is something wrong? You seem tense." "Everything's fine." Raven slammed the file folder shut. "How's the Reverend? Still as persistent?" "Yes, demanding increasingly difficult practices. I'm holding boundaries, but..." She fell silent. "But?" "Sometimes I feel like he's testing the limits on purpose. Like he's looking for, I don't know, point of no return?" Raven nodded. She'd already made her decision, but Marilu mustn't know anything. She was too professional, too squeamish about security. On Sunday, Raven went to the service. Sat in the last row, listened to the Reverend talk about sin and redemption. At one point, their eyes met. He nodded slightly. "The week is almost up," he said after the service. "Have you made your decision?" "Yes," she replied. "Come back on Thursday, as usual. We'll review the protocols." He smiled, triumphantly and a little madly, and she thought that his smile already read judgment, just not for him. For 3 days, Raven calculated her options. In the evenings, when the salon was quiet, she sat in her office, spreading out documents on her desk. Financial statements, client lists, copies of contracts. Anything that could ruin her business if those papers ended up in the wrong hands. She tried to find a way to neutralize the threat. Compromise the Reverend? Useless. His reputation for righteousness was so impeccable that any accusation would simply be considered slander. Bribery? He didn't need money. Threats? The man had clearly lost his fear, which meant it was impossible to intimidate him. On Wednesday, she audited the equipment on the 3rd floor. She paid special attention to the suspension system in the room where Marilu worked, examined every carabiner, every knot, made notes in her notebook, which fasteners could be loosened so that it looked like natural wear and tear, where the breaking point should be so that everything would happen quickly and for sure. In the evening, a specialist arrived, a man of few words, with perpetually scratched hands. He examined the equipment, listened to the requirements, gave a price. He didn't ask a single question. Curiosity was a dangerous quality in his business. Raven knew she had to keep a clean slate, no obvious signs of a crime. It had to look like an accident during voluntary practice. She studied the Reverend's medical records, heart problems, blood pressure medication, perfect basis for a heart attack. Marilu shouldn't have guessed anything. Her genuine horror and shock would be the best alibi. Raven watched her best worker. She prepared for the sessions as usual, scrutinizing every detail. Her professionalism, her maniacal attention to safety would play its part in this spectacle. By Thursday evening, everything was ready. The critical points of the suspension system loosened just enough to withstand the start of the session, but fail at the right moment. The paperwork was prepared, all the signatures of consent and risk acceptance in place. Alibi lined up. Raven had scheduled a business dinner with potential investors. She checked the list one more time. The cleaning specialist is alerted and ready to arrive on the first call. A familiar doctor is on duty near the salon. Security has been instructed. No entries in the visit log. Security cameras will be randomly disabled for the duration of the session. In the evening, she went into the room one last time, checked the fixtures. Everything looked perfect. A normal person would never have noticed the subtle changes to the insurance system. Even Marilu's fastidious eye shouldn't have detected anything. Before leaving, Raven pulled a folder of dirt on the Reverend from the safe. Notes from his sessions, photographs, receipts. Methodically destroyed each document in a small office shredder. The dead can't blackmail, and the living must remember. Some secrets cost lives. In the parking lot, she froze for a moment, looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman in the reflection looked calm and collected. Only there was something new in her eyes, the cold determination of someone who had crossed an important line. In 12 hours, the Reverend would be coming in for his last session. He would get what he had so insistently demanded: experience beyond safety. And she will keep her business, her empire built on other people's secret desires. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a doubt stirred. Was the price too high? But Raven had long ago learned not to listen to the voice of conscience. In her world, those who could make tough decisions were the survivors. She started the car. There was a business dinner ahead. The alibi had to work perfectly. And tomorrow it would all be over. And life would return to its usual course, where the main rule was to keep other people's secrets. Even if it means burying one of them with its bearer. Raven arrived at the salon 3 hours before the appointed time. The building was quiet. The day shift had already left. The night shift had not yet started. Perfect time for last-minute preparations. Climbing up to the 3rd floor, she checked the fixtures one more time. The technician had done his job flawlessly. Even a finicky eye wouldn't have noticed any changes in the design. The system should be able to withstand the initial stress, but fail at the critical moment when the load peaked. At 7 o'clock, Marilu showed up. As usual, she began preparing for the session, laying out the tools, checking the equipment, adjusting the lighting. Raven watched her through the security cameras, noting the methodicality and thoroughness of each action. "Anything special today?" Marilu asked as Raven peered into the room. "No, just a normal session. Just be careful. He hasn't been himself lately." Marilu nodded. She didn't know about the conflict with the Reverend, about his threats. To her, it was just another evening, another client. At 9, Raven walked down to her car. The security guard at the entrance escorted her out with a nod. Everyone knew she had an important meeting with investors, an airtight alibi. The Reverend showed up exactly at the appointed time. He took his usual route through the back entrance up to the 3rd floor. His eyes glittered feverishly, clearly anticipating a new, more thrilling experience. Marilu met him as usual. She did the standard preparations, took his blood pressure, checked his pulse. Everything was normal, or almost normal. Heart beat a little fast, but that could be put down to excitement. "Something special today, mistress?" Impatience could be heard in his voice. Standard program, suspensions, asphyxiation, flogging. He undressed, allowed himself to be secured in the suspension system. Marilu worked methodically, checking each fastening, but even her experienced eye failed to notice the subtle changes in the design. The session began as usual, a light warm-up, a gradual increase in exposure. The Reverend reacted correctly, his breathing remained controlled. Nothing portended tragedy. At the 20th minute, Marilou moved to a more intense phase. She tightened the straps, started working on the asphyxia, and then something happened that she couldn't have foreseen. The system failed. One carabiner, then the second, the bindings began to fail at the exact moment when the load reached a critical point. The strap around her neck tightened too much. "No!" Marilou rushed to the emergency lever, but it was too late. The Reverend's body went limp. She cut the straps, lowered him to the floor. She tried to feel for a pulse, started CPR, but in her heart, she knew it was over. The next hours merged into a nightmarish kaleidoscope. The doctor arrived and pronounced her dead of acute heart failure. A special team of cleaners quickly and efficiently removed all traces. Raven, back from a business dinner, directed the process calmly and clearly. And Marilou sat in the corner of the room, replaying the events of the evening over and over in her head. Where had she gone wrong? What had she missed? How could she have failed to notice the problems with the bindings? "It's not your fault," Raven said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "It was an accident. His heart failed." But Marilou didn't hear. Before her eyes was the Reverend's face in the last seconds, distorted not by pain or fear, but by some strange satisfaction, as if he had gotten exactly what he wanted. By morning, there was no trace of the incident. The Reverend's body was found in his car, heart attack behind the wheel. Perfect cover story. No one's gonna dig any deeper. Only Marilou, locked in her apartment, couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. There was something wrong with the way the system had failed, the way events had unfolded, in how calmly Raven had taken what had happened. But those thoughts remained vague suspicions for now. She couldn't know that a perfectly planned murder had been committed by her hands, that her professionalism and attention to detail had become part of someone else's plan, that this entire evening had been staged from start to finish, but not by the victim, but by someone else entirely. The file on Reverend Evergreen's death landed on Detective Sloan Ramirez's desk Monday morning. At first glance, nothing unusual. A heart attack while driving, an older man with health issues. Even the location of where the body was found wasn't questionable. A quiet street near a church. But something in the coroner's report made Ramirez frown. The marks on his neck, barely visible but distinctive scuff marks from something like a leather belt. Strange markings on the torso. And the time of death, hours before the body had been discovered in the car. "Ash," she called out to her partner. "Take a look at this." Detective Holloway studied the photos from the scene where the body had been found. His trained eye immediately picked out the inconsistencies, the unnatural posture, the clothes buttoned too neatly, the lack of signs of panic typical of a heart attack. They started digging deeper, checked the Reverend's bank statements, regular large cash withdrawals every Thursday. Interviewed the church staff. No one noticed anything unusual, though the secretary recalled that the Reverend had seemed more nervous in recent weeks. The trail led them to Raven's Saloon, a luxurious Victorian building, impeccable reputation, high society client list. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary premium spa. There's something wrong here. Ramirez studied the layout of the building. The third floor is supposedly under renovation, but there are lights on there at night. Raven Blackwood's initial questioning was inconclusive. The salon owner was impeccable, every answer verified, every document in place. No record of the Reverend's visits, no evidence of his presence in the building. But Ramirez's intuition continued to signal danger. She noticed the way Raven tensed when the conversation turned to surveillance cameras, how strangely her hand twitched at the mention of the third floor. They'd begun an unspoken surveillance of the salon. They noted the unusual hours of operation, the strange visitors coming in through the back entrance. The red-haired masseuse, Marilou Crystal, drew particular attention. "She's hiding something," Ash remarked after a brief survey. "Did you see how she reacted to the Reverend's pictures?" Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Raven's salon was more than just a spa. There was something darker lurking behind the facade of a respectable business. But there was no proof, only speculation and conjecture. Ramirez decided to press Marilou. The young woman was clearly nervous during the second interrogation. Her account of the events of that night was too smooth, as if memorized by heart. "Where were you the night the Reverend died?" "At home. I left the parlor at 8 o'clock in the evening." "Any witnesses?" "A security guard saw me leave. But for some reason, the security guard didn't remember the exact time, and the security cameras in the parking lot were turned off." Routine maintenance. Pressure was mounting on the salon. Detectives interviewed employees, reviewed documentation, tried to get a search warrant. But each time they hit a wall. Someone upstairs clearly didn't want publicity. "We're being interfered with." Ramirez spread the case files out on the table. "Someone very powerful doesn't want us to dig deeper." She was right. Another warrant request was followed by a call from her superiors. "Don't waste your time on an obvious case." But Ramirez wasn't about to back down. One evening, she spotted Marilu leaving the salon. The girl looked exhausted, shadows under her eyes. She kept looking back, as if she were afraid of being followed. "She'll break first," Ash said. "You just have to find the right approach." Ramirez nodded. She could feel it. The clue was somewhere close by. In the way Marilu was nervous. In the way Raven's alibi was too perfectly constructed. The way the Reverend's presence in the parlor had been carefully concealed. Meanwhile, in her office, Raven was going over security reports. The detectives weren't backing down, especially this Ramirez. Stubborn, meticulous, dangerous. Action had to be taken. Again. She pulled out her cell phone, dialed a familiar number. "We have a problem. The police are being overly persistent. Yeah, especially Detective Ramirez. We have to do something." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then they named a price. Raven wrinkled her nose. "Expensive, but cheaper than losing everything." And Marilu, in her apartment, continued to wake up at night with nightmares. She dreamed again and again of that night, of the failed bindings, of the Reverend's lifeless body, and the strange, inexplicable feeling that everything had gone wrong. Marilu stayed late at the salon. After the Reverend's death, she tended to be the last to leave, checking the equipment over and over again. In the empty corridors of the third floor, every step echoed. She was walking slowly, immersed in her thoughts, when the muffled voice of her supervisor came from behind the loose door of Raven's office. "These detectives are too pushy, especially the woman. Yes, Ramirez, something has to be done. No, I understand the cost, but it's cheaper than losing everything." Marilu froze. Something in Raven's tone, cold, businesslike, made her remember that evening. The strange calmness of her boss after the death of a client clearly organized actions to cover her tracks. Confident orders in a situation where anyone else would have panicked. She sat in her room for a long time the next morning, going over the events of the last few weeks in her mind. Raven's strange behavior before the fateful session, her sudden departure for a business dinner, an uncharacteristic rush, the all-too-quick appearance of the special cleaning crew after the Reverend's death. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the parlor was relatively quiet, Marilu went down to the guard room. Jim was sitting in front of the monitors as usual, sipping his perpetual coffee. He had worked at the salon since it opened, knew the ins and outs of the business, and treated the girls in a fatherly manner. "Jim, help me out. I can't find one of the clamps. I distinctly remember working with it the day before yesterday. Let's look at the records. Where did I put it?" "Sure thing, babe." Jim turned back to the monitors. "What time are we looking at?" "Let's go from about 5 p.m. on." The guard turned on the tape. Marilu pulled up a chair, settled in beside him. On the screen, she methodically conducted another session. Everything as usual, crisp, precise movements. Jim glanced at her from time to time. "Why don't we watch it another time?" "Wait, can you show me the tapes from the day before yesterday? From the same time?" While the guard switched tapes, Marilu scrutinized every detail of the equipment. In her 2 years on the job, she had studied this system down to the last knot, to the tiniest buckle. Every fastener, every carabiner was like letters in a familiar text to her. At first, she had almost missed it, a subtle difference in the position of the safety harness. On normal inspection, such a thing is not conspicuous. But on the recording, especially when comparing the 2 days, the difference became obvious. Slightly changed angle of the main carabiner. A slight but fatal loosening of the knot point. "Something wrong, honey?" Jim noticed how tense her back tensed. No, no, nothing's wrong. I think I remembered where I put the clamp. Thank you. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, feeling an icy lump growing inside. Everything was adding up now. Raven's strange behavior, her calmness after the tragedy, and this conversation about detectives. Raven's office door was ajar. Marilu knocked. Come in. Raven sat at her desk, elegant as ever. There were some papers on the desk in front of her, but Marilu paid no attention to them. You did this. She stopped in front of the desk. You changed the bindings before his last session. Raven slowly raised her eyes from the papers. There wasn't a shadow of worry or guilt in her gaze, just cold calculation. So? I saw the notes. I compared the bindings. They've been altered. You can't prove anything. Raven leaned back in her chair, eyeing her best worker almost sympathetically. No one but you will notice these. What did you say? The little changes. And if they do, who would believe a former dominatrix who catered to the perverted fantasies of a holy father? Marilu stared silently at the woman in front of her, a woman she believed, the one she admired, who had taught her everything about the business. He would destroy us all, Raven added almost softly. Sometimes you have to choose between bad and worse. You know that. I was your tool. You were the perfect tool. Your professionalism, your thoroughness. That's why no one would ever suspect the truth. Raven smiled, coldly and confidently. Now go. You have a client in an hour. And remember, some secrets are better kept, for the sake of all of us. For 3 days, Marilu didn't show up at the salon. Disconnected her cell phone, locked herself in her apartment. She didn't sleep, hardly ate, just smoked one after another, staring out the window at the city at night. She loved her job. For 5 years in the salon reached the pinnacle of professionalism, created an impeccable reputation among clients. Her earnings allowed her to live a life she'd never dreamed of before. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Reverend's face in the last seconds of his life, and she realized Raven wasn't just using her professionalism, she was using her trust, her dedication, made her an accessory to murder. And what if the detectives got to the truth on their own? What if they find some evidence, something she missed? Then it would be her, the person who was directly involved in the session, who would be the first to get hit. On the 4th day, she went to the police station. Detective Ramirez listened to her story in silence, not interrupting, only making notes in her notebook. You realize this could cost you your career? Yes, and that you could be charged with complicity? I realize that, but I have to do it. Events moved swiftly. Raven's arrest was conducted quietly, without a lot of fuss. She held her dignity, didn't try to deny it. She just looked at Marilu with a hard look. You've made your choice. The salon closed. The clients vanished into the night, taking their secrets with them. The staff scattered, finding work elsewhere. The Victorian building was deserted, only the wind walking through the empty corridors. The court was closed. Raven got 12 years. A clean confession and no direct intent to murder were taken into account. She hadn't tried to smear Marilu or shift the blame to her. She accepted full responsibility. Marilu testified as a key witness. The prosecutor took into account her voluntary confession and cooperation. She wasn't charged, but she had to leave her job in the field. Too much attention to the case, too many rumors floating around town. She moved to another state, started a new life. Sometimes at night she would dream about that night. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, but she didn't feel guilty anymore. She had made the right choice, maybe the only right choice in the story. A year after the trial, she received a letter. Raven wrote from prison, I hold no grudge against you. You did what you thought was right. Maybe that's true professionalism, knowing where the line is drawn. Detective Ramirez closed the case. A folder of photos and reports remained in her desk, a story of how secret desires and lust for power led to tragedy, and how one man had the courage to tell the truth. And the saloon on the outskirts of town was slowly deteriorating. They say it was bought by a businessman who planned to open a hotel, but it didn't work out. Maybe the walls held too many secrets. Maybe some secrets are better left buried in the past. Marilu no longer worked in the industry, but sometimes when she looked at her hands, she remembered. Those hands knew how to inflict pain so skillfully that it turned into pleasure. And those same hands found the power to stop evil, even at the cost of losing everything she had created. In her new life, she became a masseur, an ordinary one, with no dark secrets. And she was happy, knowing that her touch now brought only healing. And at night she no longer had nightmares about the night when professionalism became a murder weapon.